Welcome back, everybody. I'm Richard Farley, and this is another edition of This Week in Soccer. It's our third episode, and if you've joined us for the previous two, you probably have a good idea of who the rest of the panel is. Or if you're just used to the EPL Talk and World Soccer Talk product, you'll know Lawrence McKenna and you'll know Kartik Krishnaiyer. We'll bring them in a second, but first, let's go ahead and tell you what we're going to be talking about today. We have three topics today. Hopefully, we'll have plenty of time to exhaust them all. One of the more interesting phenomena in world football is the tendency towards European leagues, towards duopolies at this point. We know the famous one in Spain. Germany is developing that way. And there are various other examples in smaller leagues like Ukraine and Portugal that have gone towards two-team systems. We're going to talk about that in the second segment of the show today. Third segment of the show, we're going to talk about how we evaluate coaches and how the various pieces of unclear knowledge come together to form perceptions of people who are very drastically important to how we take in the game. But to open the show, we're going to dive into a topic that the three of us have been kicking around for a while and I'm sure has been brought up numerous times in different ways on the EPL Talk podcast. And it's a topic that, Kartik, I know you feel particularly strongly about. We all feel strongly about it. But it is the diminishing role of, I don't want to say the classic defensive midfielder, but Kartik, the Makelele role is diminishing in the current game.
Right, and I felt that Claude Makelele was maybe the most important player of the last decade in changing tactics in world football. And we saw teams go from having a partial ball winner, box-to-box midfielder, to having a pure ball-winning midfielder who had a range of passing but was also graceful in tackling, to then maybe employing two defensive midfielders in bigger games as a shield in front of the back four. Now what we're finding is top teams in Europe, starting with Barcelona. I think the trend started there, obviously with Busquets and Xavi Hernandez playing in maybe deeper roles, to more mobile, passing, attack-minded midfielders sitting deep as deep-lying playmakers. We see Chelsea employing Frank Lampard and Ramirez in this role in their first three matches under Jose Mourinho, as where you would put the traditional defensive midfielders, where traditionally Makelele and Essien played in Mourinho's last stint. We've seen Manchester City, who under Roberto Mancini oftentimes employed a shield of two, sometimes three players. Gareth Barry was a regular for Manchester City. You would oftentimes see him flanked by Nigel de Jong or Jack Rodwell last season. Now you're not seeing any of that under Manuel Pellegrini. You're seeing Yaya Toure, who very much is looking to get up the pitch, flanked by Fernandinho, also looking very much to get up the pitch in sort of the Ramirez role for Chelsea. Bayern has moved away from the traditional defensive midfield role. That kind of began before Pep got there, but it's intensified now with Luis Gustavo and Emre Can's transfers within the Bundesliga to other clubs, to lesser clubs in the Bundesliga. We're seeing it at the top of European football. We're seeing it with the top sides. Another example actually is Borussia Dortmund. You see Gundogan get forward on the left. You'll see Marco Reus now employed maybe more in a Götze type role. Lining up deeper in the formation than Götze did, but getting up as far up the pitch as Götze did before Götze transferred to Bayern, of course. But we're seeing lesser teams in these big leagues, the teams, the likes of the West Hams and the Bayer Leverkusen. So Bayer Leverkusen is not a lesser team. They're in Champions League, but not a team that's going to win a title, as we talk about duopolies. Those sorts of teams continuing to employ holding midfielders or the traditional defensive midfielders. So I think what's interesting, guys, is the top teams in both leagues, not in both leagues, in all these European leagues seem to be moving away from the defensive midfielder, looking to get better passers on the pitch, guys who can contribute to the attack and can supplement the attack and just get their most talented players on the pitch, whereas other sides, the sides further down the table that are competing to try and stay in the league or make Champions League, are employing traditional defensive midfielders.
Yeah, that's a good point, the last one you made. You see a team like Southampton, one of their big purchases this year was Scotland and bring in a Vincent Wanyama, obviously a more destroyer type of midfielder. But let's not get too far down the road here, Lawrence. To what extent, I mean, I throw this to you because I heard Xabi Alonso mention that, but to what extent do you even agree with what Kartik has said? To what extent do you agree that the defensive midfielder is fading out of the modern game?
I think we've certainly learned a lot about the defensive midfielder in recent years. And I don't know, does anyone else agree that for some strange reason we made Makelele like some sort of a point in history?
Yeah, I would agree with that, but I don't know if the reason is strange.
I just find it weird that we. I mean, he never really struck me as kind of a particularly famous. He was never like. He never struck me as a Galactico type player. I guess he kind of summed up what everyone was aiming towards at some point. That became part of the Mourinho era, and it was sort of like now we're looking at the more humble sort of players, these kind of guys that we can look for the influences, because we want to be a bit more concerted and thoughtful about our football in a sense. And Makelele allowed us to do that, and I think that what that meant was that we moved towards systems where the defensive midfielder's role isn't negated, but it's moved to a slightly different position on the pitch. So basically other people do that role, or the rotation with the defensive midfielder is basically that. Maybe the best example of that is Javier Mascherano being moved back at Barcelona. Mm-hmm. That you just see a defensive midfielder who plays that role pretty much, but just 10 feet further back.
Yeah, I think it's really interesting. Yeah, I think it's very interesting. A lot of this has a lot of this conversation comes from the proliferation of the 4-2-3-1 formation, and as Kartik has said, it also results from a new fascination with possession that Barcelona has brought in, where you don't want to sacrifice somebody who could be a key holder, and in fact, you maybe want to play a second player deep to promote a possession game. We're moving away from where transition football had more of a primacy, maybe 6 or 8 years ago. I think that's an interesting thing to talk about, Kartik. How much of this discussion is being fueled by just the proliferation of 4-2-3-1?
I think, guys, that's probably the biggest factor in it is the formation, the 4-2-3-1. You're seeing a value placed on possession, a value placed on possession in the midfield, and a value placed on the versatility of midfielders. And that versatility lends itself to employing players like Xabi Alonso, putting players like Ramirez, Fernandinho, a player like Thiago, who just has gotten injured for Bayern. But a player like that, Shaqiri is another example at Bayern, a player Pep inherited from Jupp Heynckes. Those are the types of players that you see in that role in that 4-2-3-1 formation. And we're seeing even variations of the 4-2-3-1 formation employed by Barcelona at times, and now by Chelsea, where that one is not an out-and-out striker, but is just another midfielder. And you're playing with a false nine. Fabregas can play as a false nine for Barcelona. We've seen that. For Chelsea, in fact, in this game against Manchester United, you could argue Schürrle wasn't even a false nine. They just played without a striker.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's interesting, and I think that's probably a segment for maybe even next week's show, whether the false nine has actually gone from being internet meme to something that we really should consider a relevant and widespread tactical influence in today's game. But let's stick with the Makelele role, because Lawrence, you brought up something very interesting just about Makelele as being a point in time, and there's a certain caricature around that. I want to get into perception, because for me, what really feeds into this conversation is the misconception that Makelele was such a one-dimensional player, and part of that had to do with his stature, part of that had to do with his actual usage by his coaches, but it did create somewhat of an archetype for that position. And I'm wondering if the perception that we're moving away from the defensive midfielder is fueled by the fact that fewer defensive midfielders look like Makelele, or look like a Nigel de Jong, a Gennaro Gattuso, somebody that we probably mistakenly think of as a one-dimensional player. Does the fact that the players playing in that role actually look more like a Sergio Busquets feed into this perception?
I think the look is an interesting one, especially for my camera. No, I think the look is an interesting one because, I mean, I agree that certain people fit certain roles, but then I think it's also it's down to certain players to redefine that role. So, for instance, I probably will go to Xabi Alonso at this point and say that. And say that his influence on the game isn't always what's happening on the ball, and you'd argue that he shepherds the play, those kind of things. And but I'm not saying that is at all how we define what the defensive midfielder does. What I'm saying is that is it now about reactive and inactive coaches, or however you want to define it? So someone either reacting to a tactical thing or setting up tactically and almost being the aggressor in the situation. And it's just been, in the past, maybe the Benitez or the Mourinho-like coaches were more, they set up to be a little more defensive and therefore react to the opposition, whereas now the trend is to be a bit more aggressive and set the tone of the game, if you know what I mean.
Yeah, I do know what you mean. Kartik, reactive versus proactive, and that almost defines our conception of the defensive midfielder role. Yeah. Lawrence brought up two examples of coaches that used it. The first thing that came to my mind was a lot of people like to, I don't know, criticize, but describe Alex Ferguson's tactics as generally reactive, maybe not in-game reactive. But when you think about the defensive midfielders Alex Ferguson used, there isn't a huge list. There's pretty much Roy Keane, and then his modern teams have actually used a Michael Carrick type of player.
Right, yeah, maybe Nicky Butt also, but after Roy Keane was gone and Nicky Butt had transferred away, you saw Darren Fletcher and Michael Carrick in that role. Hargreaves for a little bit before Hargreaves got hurt. Hargreaves was more of a but maybe a little bit more out of the Keane mold, and not a destroyer, but a really defensive-minded player. But Carrick and Fletcher were both mobile players, good passers. Again, speaking of yesterday's game against Chelsea, I thought Carrick was one of the best players, one of the most influential players on the pitch in a match which wasn't that enlightening in reality. But Carrick was one of the better players. But yeah, I think Lawrence brings up a good point about reactive managers, and maybe defensive midfielders were a shield, a way to let the game come to you, soak up some pressure, and then if you want to hit the other team on a break and try and win games that way. We've seen, obviously, Manchester City in their title-winning season, 2011-2012, use Gareth Barry in every match, use Nigel de Jong often after he came back from injury, and oftentimes put other guys in that shield role and play them both at the same time often, de Jong and Barry.
Can I say, though, I also think it's maybe a bit of a straw man or whatever you want to call it, to put just because that player occupies that position on the pitch, therefore he fulfills a certain role.
Well, but those players, in that specific case, the case of Barry and de Jong, they were very much defensive midfielders, ball winners, who would then play the ball forward and not do a whole lot else. But they were tactically
but it's that playing the ball forward which you would argue define their role as much as protecting.
Yeah, oh, absolutely, and I think that's something Manchester City has missed in its first two matches, not playing Gareth Barry, is that he would play the ball forward, and he tactically, his positioning sense, this is why Mancini valued him so much, his positioning sense was impeccable. He was very rarely caught out of position in his time at City. But you know, getting back to the original point, I think you've got a lot of managers also who see the ability to use that deep-lying player. Arsene Wenger is another example. Use that deep-lying player as a player that can actually hold the ball and bring the ball, dribble the ball up the pitch, which isn't necessarily the Barcelona way. We talk about Barcelona having a lot of influence on the tactics of teams playing a 4-2-3-1. But in Arsenal's case, you've got a player like Mikel Arteta or Aaron Ramsey who can play nice, short, crisp passes, but can also dribble the ball up the pitch. And in Arteta's case, he's very good. He has held the ball arguably as well as just about anyone in English football going back to his days at Everton over the course of the last 5 to 7 seasons. He's been very good in that role. So good in that role that England felt like it would be a lot of people around the England camp thought it would be a good idea to get him naturalized and get him into the England team because he had a unique skill that very few English players have.
Lawrence, you know, we're actually already running out of time in this segment, but there are a couple of other things that we should hit on before moving on. And I think my main thoughts right now are dwelling on what Kartik kind of said in his introduction, a couple of points. First, you do see teams lower down in the tables of leagues still using these type of players because they can be effective in those limited roles. But higher up, why would a team with the resources of a Manchester City, Manchester United, Chelsea, Real Madrid, Barcelona, why would they at any position have the need to accept a player that really plays a one-dimensional role? Why would they, given the talent at their disposal, ever design a system where you have just a classic defensive, single-minded, destroying midfielder? It seems like putting a limit on a team that has unlimited resources.
Or is it giving you tangibles when the rest of your team need somewhere to go from?
Well, what exactly do you mean by that? I think I'm inferring.
I'm trying to think of a system. You could go to basically anyone who has a deep line midfielder. You'll often find that they have people further up the pitch who are very creative. typical Liverpool fan? Could you go to someone like Javier Mascherano a few years ago who would just destroy and destroy and destroy, and everyone else around would kind of, be able to? I'd argue that if he was in a Chelsea side, there would be, there'd be a very interesting role for him right now.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that is very interesting. Kartik, I think that what we've described over the course of this conversation has been an evolution to this point where we evolved to, because of the nature of transition football to the need for a defensive midfielder, and now because of the prominence of possession football, we've gone to where people are usually using one, most often two, skilled holding midfielders, which prompts the question, well, what's next?
That is a good question, because we're seeing this at the top level, but then we see teams like West Ham. West Ham will always have a pure defensive midfielder in their team under Sam Allardyce. We're seeing other teams employ that further down the table in England, further down the table, as I mentioned, even starting with Bayer Leverkusen, who finished third in the Bundesliga last year, down the table in the Bundesliga. In Spain, you've got players that are like that. Gary Medel, the Chilean international, just moved to the English league. Yeah. He's a classic defensive midfielder in La Liga the last several seasons, and he's going to be that in Cardiff also, I'm sure, playing that very specific role. So my question about what happens next is a good one, because I think that segues us nicely, guys, to our second topic, which is about the emerging duopolies in a lot of European leagues. We look at what's happened in the Bundesliga the last few seasons. It's been Borussia Dortmund and Bayern Munich. Obviously, much has been written about the duopoly in Spain with Real Madrid and Barcelona. Italy, Juventus has been on the top the last year. Napoli finished second last season, but the thought is eventually it becomes Milan again as that second team. England is not in that duopoly state yet, but more or less people have established three teams as title contenders. I would argue potentially Arsenal could be a title contender if they continue on their path, but they need to beef up depth-wise. But duopolies in European leagues, the same thing in Holland, PSV and Ajax. Is this good for football, and do you think that this is a permanent state or just a temporary condition in these big leagues? Let's start with you, Richard.
Well, good versus bad, I'll leave that to Lawrence, although I'm sure I'll have an opinion in about 15 minutes.
Sure.
I see this as a natural evolution of almost any system, really. It speaks to the stakes that have been injected into football, that we have leagues where one team has done something right, both commercially and on the field, sprinted out ahead of the pack, a la a Bayern, a la, over the last few years, a PSG. And then you have to have one team, maybe more than one team, but usually it is only one team that goes and tracks them down, so to speak. That's not the nature of all duopolies. We've seen a little bit more organic growth in the Netherlands, for example. Portugal has kind of shed Sporting a little bit, and it's Benfica and Porto. The question I have, and maybe this is a good throw to Lawrence at this point, is whether it's even, or maybe you, Kartik, can take this, whether it's something that we should try to legislate against. Is it a bad thing? It goes right back to you. Is it a bad thing or a good thing?
In a field where clubs like Bayern Munich and Real Madrid and Juventus don't have all the advantages that they currently have under this system, in the financial fair play regime, but as long as Platini and UEFA insist on implementing this, I think outside of England, you're going to have this duopoly. And what happens in England is going to be interesting, because obviously you have a club with a strong ethos in Arsenal and an ideology that has come from their manager, Arsene Wenger. But when Wenger is off the scene, who knows if Arsenal has the staying power to compete with Manchester United, Manchester City, and Chelsea, and maybe then it becomes a three-team league once Wenger is gone.
But for years, Stuttgart, Schalke, Werder Bremen, Wolfsburg, Borussia Dortmund would kind of alternate as the annual competitor, but they were all at that kind of second tier. And one of the effects that has within the league is that it disperses the talent that can't go to the top team amongst a bunch of other potential competitors. But as those teams have financial problems, as they make mistakes on the field with poor management, as they just run into circumstances they can't control, they drop off. And I think that's what you've seen in Germany now, that Borussia Dortmund, largely because they do have an infrastructure in place drawing 80,000 fans per game, they have had the staying power to be the one team that hasn't fallen off by Stuttgart, hasn't been dumb like Hamburg, hasn't gone through this weird style over results period of Werder. at the end, now Borussia Dortmund is the club that can pull the Marco Reus's away from Bayern, that can try to compete for some of these players. And maybe in time you'll see Monaco will develop into that team in France, or you'll see in Italy that instead of players debating between Milan and Inter, Kartik, they're going to go to Milan in the future.
Yeah, I think that may inevitably happen right now with the current state of Inter, although they've hired a brilliant manager who we'll talk about in the next segment, away from Napoli. Go ahead.
Is the worry not what that's based? Is that worry not what that's based on? I mean, you were talking about Germany as a good system.
Well, I think it's a real good point, Lawrence, you make, because I think that what Richard was trying to get at is for years there were teams that popped up and then went through odd, difficult periods where they were mid-table in Germany. Now Dortmund is clearly established as that second team. They're getting guys in the transfer market that challenging team to Bayern Munich never used to get. The types of players that would go to Bayern or go to another league.
They're challenging from from what we can perceive, some solid building, having 80,000 fans a week, however many fans it is a week, and those kind of things. The worry is, I guess, that we've engineered something through finances, which you'd argue might not be sustainable, and therefore, it does see this kind of thickening of the top, but doesn't necessarily. That doesn't mean it's fair. It doesn't mean it's an oligopoly or whatever you want to call it.
Yeah, I don't know if the Germany case is really that. I think Dortmund maybe kind of won a battle of attrition in a way that they basically, although they almost went bankrupt, so I don't know how much you can say they didn't screw up, but they were kind of there when other teams faded, and then they became, partly because of their own good work and partly because of the circumstances, they became the number two. In other places, you can see this happening without a major injection of cash. For example, in Portugal, Sporting is not keeping up with Benfica and Porto. Well, why is that? Well, it's not necessarily because they don't have the resources. It's because they just aren't good enough. And at this point, if a player has a choice between Sporting, Porto, and Benfica, it's kind of like, well, I'm going to go to Porto and Benfica, and then if that doesn't work out, then yeah, Sporting's fine. I think that's the same thing that we would see in the Ukraine, we would see in the Netherlands, and eventually we're going to see in these other examples. I do wonder, Kartik, how much money is going to reinforce it, because most leagues have one or two places in Champions League sealed up. Amongst leagues we talk about, they all have at least two, except for Ukraine is 1+1. A place like Turkey that also has a duopoly, they're a 1+1 league, as is Holland. Russia also, which kind of, they're not quite a duopoly, but Zenit and CSKA are going to be competing for the title every year. Yeah. So, Kartik, I wonder how much, like you said, not only financial fair play, but Champions League feeds into this.
And Russia is a good example. I'm glad you brought that up, Richard, because I was going to. Russia, as you see a vetting process and the clubs that have popped up because of oligarchs and money, temporary money, fall back down. Anzi is the latest example. There are a couple other examples in Russian football, and will continue to be a few more examples. You're going to see a duopoly, in my opinion, between CSKA and Zenit. Maybe not in the next year or two, but 5 years down the road, it's going to be a two-team league. I really believe that. And maybe with a third team challenging temporarily, and coming and going. But it's a worrying trend. But then I guess if you look at it in a different sense, it makes Champions League more competitive. Borussia Dortmund was genuinely close to winning the European Cup last year. It's been a while. It's been since Porto that we had a genuine outsider team challenge to win a Champions League the way Dortmund did last season. So maybe in some sense it's a good thing, because that second club in each country is getting stronger. And nations where we typically had one strong team in European competition, Bayern Munich in the case of Germany over the course of the last decade. Obviously, prior to that, Leverkusen had been in a final, and then Dortmund had won a final. But in addition to Munich, I think maybe it's a good thing for European competition. You see Galatasaray making a run in Europe last year. You've seen now the ability, Lyon would typically get to the knockout stages in the Champions League, but they wouldn't be a threat to win it. Now you see PSG and then maybe potentially Monaco into the future as a threat to get to a final, as a threat to win the European Cup. So maybe this is a good thing for continental football if it's not such a good thing for domestic football.
That's very interesting. I mean, even last year you had a team like Malaga who a lot of people still think they should have knocked out Dortmund in the quarterfinals last year.
It may have been them instead of Dortmund, but again, a genuine outsider, a real outsider in Malaga. I mean, more so than Dortmund.
And that's also very interesting too, because they, I don't want to say had the luxury because they had problems with UEFA, but they basically threw away their domestic campaign last year because they knew they weren't going to be able to get into Europe this year. And we do see a lot of leagues, their whole identity is based upon Big Two, Spain being the biggest example, but we've mentioned Ukraine, we've mentioned the Netherlands, Portugal, and the fans have adjusted. And it may be an adjustment they can survive, but Kartik, I completely agree. It is an unfair adjustment. The final thing that we want to talk about on today's show, Kartik, this is a very fascinating topic for me because it does get a little bit philosophical, but particularly with so many new coaches coming into the Premier League, new managers taking over prominent title-contending clubs, it's interesting to think about the ways in which we evaluate coaches. You take Manuel Pellegrini over the last 2 weeks going from God to somebody that's going to be scrutinized a little bit for how he handled the match in Wales. Kartik, what's interesting to me about this whole discussion is that we tend to judge coaches on their team's results, the results that they get over their perceived level of talent, how they go about those results in terms of tactics and style. But really, everything that we use to evaluate a manager is so dependent on the players, and it makes it very difficult to sift through the noise to get at an actual conclusion.
Right, and I think now there's a great reactiveness to the first few fixtures of the season while players are unsettled because of transfer rumors, that we're judging managers based on that. And we're already seeing that there are managers that are new in their jobs. We have a disproportionate number of managers new in their jobs at big clubs this season compared to previous years. We have, obviously, the three top clubs in England last season all have new managers this season. In the case of Chelsea, a manager who's managed them before. But in the case of Manchester United and Manchester City, a completely new manager. Bayern, the European champions, have a new manager. Real Madrid, as usual, have a new manager. But they have a very different manager philosophically in Carlo Ancelotti. Right. And I think maybe most significantly of all, PSG has Laurent Blanc, who is a very odd choice for a club of their ambition. But maybe a forced choice because other people didn't want to take the job, given the level of expectation. But there's a lot of scrutiny of Ancelotti. Guardiola has not gotten Bayern off to the cleanest start, even though they're perfect. They have a full 9 points. They're on their way to getting, as we record this, to 12 points before the European Super Cup, their match against Freiburg. But there's a lot of scrutiny of managers at an early stage with sides of players that they've inherited, that they've largely inherited. This goes to your point, Richard.
Also,
Lawrence.
Kartik, don't you think that, for instance, a friend of mine made a really good point the other night. He said, if Benitez had gone to Old Trafford and played the formation that Mourinho did, he would have been castigated. He would have been stripped bare in the media and told to get out of Chelsea.
And by Chelsea supporters. Especially.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I think that speaks to a huge point, right? Within football, that very often so much of what we make our judgments on is very often actually connected to an intangible or something which is based on something reasonable, if you like. And I think there are many managers in the Premier League that if they'd gone to Old Trafford, even Mark Hughes, even any of the managers, if they'd have gone to Old Trafford and done that, they would have had huge question marks over their head. But because it's Mourinho, we believe he has a big plan, etc., etc., and so we're willing to allow more time. Do you think that he's earned that through result? I'm trying to work out how he's earned that as
I think he's earned that by being snarky and charming in the press, quite frankly.
But also, Kartik, his success also ends in that.
What?
His success ends in that, in a sense, doesn't it?
Well, yeah, his success is in his first stint at Chelsea, but I think there is a healthy amount of skepticism about Jose Mourinho in England this time at Chelsea, which I don't think he fully expected when he came back from Spain. He thought he was going to be welcomed as a conquering hero, which he was by Chelsea supporters. But I think Mourinho was genuinely surprised by the skepticism on the pages of The Guardian and The Telegraph and The Independent upon his return, and his and even some mocking of him. But you make a good point about the tactics, because we assume because of Mourinho's success there was something brilliant in what he executed last night in this match against Manchester United. Many managers have gone to to Old Trafford, set up tactically, and been savage in the media. Have been called negative, caveman, anti-football, you name it. And it's very funny because I think Mourinho now is seeing again his relationship with the English press evolving positively, because when he did that with Madrid, I mean, Madrid did beat Barcelona a fair number of times while Mourinho was there, but they would resort to hacking, they would resort to excessively physical play.
But that's different, Cartico, to just setting up tactically.
Well, right, but they were cynical.
Night,
Real Madrid was cynical in how they played Barcelona, especially in Mourinho's first season. Those two matches in the league were incredibly cynical. It's basically, he said, we have 10 cautions to go around on Messi, so 10 different guys foul Messi and pick up a yellow card before we have to take him out, type of thing. I mean, that's a pretty strong allegation, but you know what I'm trying to say. Yeah. It was cynical then, and it's cynical now. Mm-hmm. Richard, just a different type of cynicism.
Yeah, in a way. Richard, I mean, I'd be interested to hear what you have to say about this kind of the judgment of managers from a sense of, very often we're not judging them on. We're judging from what we see and then and making a conclusion and then just talking.
Pretty much, we engage in this process of finding evidence to confirm our bias. I think one interesting example here is Tony Pulis. Obviously, it's an interesting example because it's so polarizing. But even to this day, you'll have people say that Tony Pulis was good for Stoke. He did what he could. People are unduly stigmatizing the tactics that he employed, while other people point to Stoke's net spend, some of the people that were brought in that he failed to utilize, and just the fact that they didn't really make that much progress after establishing themselves as a Premier League team. And you have to sit back and wonder how so many intelligent people are looking at the same thing and coming up with such incredibly drastically different results. It's not like the Rafa Benitez example where everybody can kind of go, well, he's a little bit more negative than most managers at this level, so we're going to talk it up a lot because that's his big difference, and let's hammer this into the ground. With Pulis, it really is, this is a terrible approach, this is a great approach, and it just, to me, reinforces the fact that we don't really do a good job of evaluating managers.
Well, do you think also it's a case of, so how should managers be evaluated? Should it be a results-based thing, or should it be, should it be based on, how entertaining they are, or do managers earn that? Do they lay out their stall and then, say, right, judge me on this? Because it's how you earn that. Because very often, I also think it's a bit ridiculous. I think it's an interesting thing that when new managers come on the scene, we almost assume that they've been plucked off the street. And it's like, right, okay, so this guy's new, right, we'll give this one a try. No, this man's been through years of learning what it is to be a manager, or woman, and now they're here. Like, this is the pinnacle. This is like when you've gone for your dream job interview, got it, and then you're doing it, Does that make any sense? It
does make sense. And then going back to, how should we evaluate managers, how can we evaluate managers, a lot of people have brought up the idea that David Moyes is going to be a great case study in how effective managers really are, because not only is he going to be, we're going to compare him to somebody who has results, reputation. Every single indicator says Alex Ferguson is a successful manager, not merely a function of his players. Well, Manchester United now have not spent that much money. Whether they do or not, the team that David Moyes has this year is going to be built around the same players that Alex Ferguson led to success. So if David Moyes doesn't lead them to success, the only real factors that we can point to are diminished player performance, injuries, aging, and how much we'll have to evaluate how much David Moyes really played into diminished player performances. I think when we're evaluating managers, that's the one thing I really feel comfortable with. The Blanc example at PSG, that's not such a great one, but we can go, hey, if he falls off from first place or he doesn't replicate Ancelotti's results, even though they have invested again and they brought in an Edinson Cavani, then what's there to say for Laurent Blanc? But the other stuff about style and style of play, entertaining, whether they made the accurate tactical decisions, even though a lot of times we don't even know how healthy their bench options were, it's all a little bit more nebulous.
Kartik, is it also very often that people just don't know what's going on and therefore they will speculate, but they'll almost present it as fact in a way?
Yeah, I think that has a lot to do with it, Lawrence. I think the themes that Richard have hit on are very, very pertinent to this discussion. Let's be honest. We do not have a hard and fast way of determining who a successful manager is, even at a top club. Real Madrid, that's been through so many managers, we can't determine who are the most successful managers at Real Madrid. Is it Fabio Capello because he won 2 titles, or is Fabio Capello not the most successful manager because he employed dour tactics and got sacked by a board at the club that wanted more than what was produced? So that's, I think, ultimately the test is what is actually the standard.
Mm-hmm. And I think also, I think also just there is, like, the Mancini example is a good one too, because obviously a lot of City supporters were very upset about that. But there is a lot about that situation that we don't know. We don't know exactly if he was, to what degree he was seeing eye to eye with the people that were making the moves. We don't know whether behind the scenes he was making suggestions or imploring the club to do things that they just disagreed with, or basically their evaluations were the same as other people who critique Mancini, that he had a certain level of talent, and in their estimations he didn't meet up to that level. A lot of the things that I just mentioned we just can't see, and we're never going to get accurate reporting on.
I think in the Mancini example, Richard, sorry to interrupt, but I just want to clarify on that, since I support City. I think hindsight is going to be what judges Mancini more than the emotion of supporters when it happened, and theories of people like me that, oh well, he was very tactical, that's why he played guys like Gareth Barry and James Milner, Nigel de Jong all the time, guys that Pellegrini wouldn't sign or wouldn't use. So I think hindsight gives us some perspective on that. But again, I mean, how do we judge necessarily? And this is a question for either one of you. Jose Mourinho leaves Chelsea. Chelsea continues to achieve success under Ancelotti. He think they won a trophy. Ancelotti, they won multiple trophies. They won multiple trophies under Di Matteo. They won a trophy under Benitez. So to what extent is returning to Jose Mourinho, is Jose Mourinho really the most successful Chelsea manager? Because you could argue he took Ranieri's team that may have won the title the following year anyway under Ranieri and just won the title with them. You could make that argument. Wow. I'm not making that argument, but you could make that argument.
See, what you could say is that ultimately it's about the significance that we put on managers, and sometimes there's maybe too much significance put on a manager. But again, it's because we're dealing with the intangibles, or the factors which can't necessarily be measured right now, which mean that people will go to the nearest thing that they can measure and try and make that as measurable as possible. When actually, maybe it's a bit like science. It's kind of accepting that there are some things you can't talk about, and maybe just signposting speculation as opposed to allowing it to just come out as a perceived truth.
Yeah. Well, you mentioned science. I think one thing in evaluating any manager you have to do is come up with a baseline. Like, what performance are we measuring this manager against?
Mourinho is not the control. I would say that if that's the case, then Mourinho is definitely not the control manager.
Yeah, I mean, that's a really good example of how it's almost impossible to establish a baseline, because at the same time that he was brought in, he was allowed to bring in a number of players that made it impossible to compare him with Claudio Ranieri. And while intuitively I feel you can look at those teams, you can look at the talent that his competitors have, and saw how his influence made that team a dominant team for those couple of years.
So
that's all conjecture.
David Moyes is a great control then in that sense, because we've got basically the same squad at Manchester United. We've got a David Moyes who maybe he's like the Doctor. He's slightly he's changed his suit a little bit, but he's essentially the same man. And we're introducing him into a new situation at the Champions League and those kind of things. So we've got a good yardstick.
Yeah, I would say that Monday was a really good example of the influence a coach can have, because we saw how differently Manchester United played and how differently they reacted to that scenario than they would have under Alex Ferguson. There's no question in my mind they would have gone for 3 under Ferguson, where that team was content with 1 throughout that whole match. And I think we saw the limit to players in that match, because obviously Manchester United, as we saw throughout that game, because when they were going forward, they were able to at least stress Chelsea and force Cahill and Terry into some meaningful plays. We saw Manchester United have the talent to win that game, but they didn't have the coach yesterday, did they? So what we can really say there is that there's a limit to how much players can really influence influence a coach.
I don't know if that's fair, but towards David Moyes. I mean, I saw some progressive substitutions from Manchester United, saw negative substitutions from Chelsea, but your point's well taken. Ferguson generally won those matches, right?
But it's also that totally plays into what we were saying at the beginning of this, that it's all about perception. So is it what's progressive? Because Mourinho might see a point as progressive in a sense and undermining to Moyes or blah, blah, blah. So, if that's his aim, then his substitutions are progressive, Kartik.
Well, I guess that's the case. I'm thinking about bringing in Giggs and Ashley Young versus bringing in Mikel and also Poloqueta. I mean, bringing in two defensive-minded players to counter two more attacking players and more width from Manchester United.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think under Ferguson
for Nigeria.
I mean, again, we get back to this point of perception that Lawrence was talking about. Like, I think it's very easy to say that Shinji Kagawa probably would have played yesterday if Ferguson was still manager. But we don't know for sure.
Yes.
We don't know for sure. But it is a really, really interesting case because it's just not that long ago that Alex Ferguson was not only managing that team, but with the same players and in similar situations. And quite frankly, I mean, we'll see this throughout the year that Moyes managed like an Everton manager yesterday, not a Manchester United manager. And that's what's going to make this comparison relevant. Now, whether we have these kind of comparisons for other managers that we are going to pass judgment on, no, we don't, but we still pass judgment on them.
And I think that probably, does that bring us to a natural conclusion?
Yeah, I think that's a logical place to stop and pick up the discussion next week, guys.
Exactly. Thank you very much for joining us on This Week in Soccer. Are we numbering these episodes?
Yes.
Sure. Episode 3.
Episode 3.
Yes.
3. Thank you very much for joining us. If you do have any feedback, then you know where to leave it. There's a comment section below, whether you're listening or you are watching. If you haven't already subscribed, then go to either YouTube or iTunes or wherever you're listening to this and do that, and the podcast or video will appear in your sleep. In the meantime, Kartik, thank you.
Thank you, Lawrence.
No, thank you. And Richard, thank you.
Thank you, Lawrence. You're less angelic now than you were 15 minutes ago, though.
No, I know. It's the light. It's just the light. It's in many ways that sums up our final conversation best. We'll see you very soon.